Hey guys, one question that I'm asked a whole lot is, what kind of paint should I buy? And if you walk into an art store, you're just inundated by all these choices. There's just so much paint. And the price points, going from fairly inexpensive to extremely expensive. And you wonder, do I really need to buy the expensive paints? If you're serious about art, you want to make sure that you buy the right thing. Well, paints are basically just sticky material that won't fall off the surface that you put it on. Not too complex. But with that said, it is awfully hard to get any painting done without, paint. But to understand what you should be spending on this sticky stuff, it really helps to understand what paint actually is in the first place. And you can break most paints down into two parts. Really four parts, but we only need to think about two right now. The first is the medium, which is also called a binding agent or the binder because it holds everything together. Pretty simple. And the other part is the pigment. And the pigment is what gives it the color and opacity. How hard it is to see through the paint, if it's clear or not. Now, like for oil paint, the binding agent is usually linseed oil, and that's why because it's an oil, that's why you have to use things like turpentine and white spirits and stuff to break it down to work with it and stuff. Acrylics, you use acrylic polymer emulsion is the binding agent, and then of course pigment is thrown into that. It's water-based, but if you add water to thin the paint, when you're painting, you'll notice you'll get a crackling when the paint dries, and that's because the acrylic polymers, they chain together when they're drying, and if you water them down, the chains are broken apart too far, then it makes them crack. But if you want to get that effect, I use different mediums. You can get a high flow acrylic medium, makes it work like water. You don't get the chaining, unless you want the chaining. That can be pretty cool. But the expense for the paints, though, is often due to the pigments that they are made from and how much they actually use. So if you're using an oil paint, especially back in the day, they would make the different colors by using different ingredients, like sloe berries to make certain green and certain really rare minerals to make other colors and things. And some of these things are expensive. So if in your art you're wanting to use some of this exotic sort of materials in your paints, of course they're going to be more expensive. One thing though, and I want to give you a tip, because if you go into the art store, very often the range of price that you'll see is for student quality paints and then professional quality paints. Now, the tip is that's really a misnomer. It's a bit of a trick. It's a psychological ploy that they're using on you. So really what it is a range of how much pigment is in the paint. So in the student quality, there's less pigment. In the professional quality, there's a whole lot more pigment. So you may wonder, well, isn't having a lot of pigment better? It just depends on what you're working on, really. Let me show you some paints. Aha. Okay. So let me check my label here. Okay. So this is it's a cadmium yellow, but it's student quality, and this other one, where's the label? It's fluorescent red. Okay. So it's student quality. Now, you say, well, John, aren't you a professional artist? Shouldn't you use professional paints? Well, I do. I've got racks and racks and shelves of paint all over the place and all different types. But I love this stuff. I love the student quality, and the reason is because it doesn't have quite as much pigment as the others. And for me, I add pigment into my paint, so I'll mix it to the way I like it. So I've got dry pigments, I've got liquid pigments back here, and they're highly pigmented pigments, so I can make them very bright. But I can also make subtle shifts in color that I want. So I'll mix the paint that I want. And the student quality to me is like a wonderful place to start. And people often say, if they're trying to recreate one of my paintings, they have a hard time recreating some of my colors, but it's because I mix the colors. It's not something you can necessarily just buy in a store. So that gives me some flexibility in things. If you're wanting to work on something where you need a lot of pigment, then getting the more expensive paints kind of makes sense. Also, one benefit of using the student quality is because there's a lot of binding agent, a lot of the medium for the pigment. If I'm wanting to work on a more translucent or see-through or do different layers or glazing sort of techniques, then I can use one of those paints and add different mediums to thin it down even more, or add some liquid, very transparent color to it. And then I'll end up with layers and layers of transparent paint, and that makes it nice and easy. So I just wanted to leave you guys with the idea that the student quality paints doesn't mean that they're inferior. You know, you can save a little bit of money on them. Sometimes with some of the paint, though, you want to be careful. Like, you get a good brand, because some of them, the binding agent isn't so good. So the paint itself isn't a very good quality. So, so make sure you get a good brand, but it doesn't have to be the most expensive paint that's out there. And the most important part of any of this, like I say, paint is just sticky stuff that you put on a surface. The most important part of painting is what comes from the inside. You know, that's you can't put that in a bottle. So have fun creating, guys, and good luck buying paint.